The lawyer's hands trembled as he read the final line of my grandfather's will, and I watched my entire family's faces crumble in real time. My cousin Emma, the golden child who had stolen every birthday, every Christmas, every moment of love that should have been mine for the past 15 years, was staring at me with pure hatred burning in her perfect blue eyes. The room was dead silent, except for my aunt's sharp intake of breath and my uncle's muttered curse. Because after a lifetime of being invisible, of being the forgotten one, I had just inherited everything. Not because I was the favorite, but because I was the only one who had passed grandfather's test. The only one who truly understood what family meant. But let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with my victory. It starts with a 7-year-old girl who just wanted someone to notice she existed. I was 7 when Emma was born, and that was the day I became a ghost in my own family. Before her arrival, I wasn't exactly the center of attention, but I had my place. My parents loved me in their quiet way, my grandparents would smile when I visited, and family gatherings felt warm and inclusive. I was just a normal kid with normal problems, doing normal kid things like learning to ride a bike and struggling with multiplication tables. Then Emma came along, and she was perfect. Not just regular baby perfect, but genuinely, objectively, undeniably perfect. She had these enormous blue eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence even as an infant, golden curls that caught the light just right, and this musical laugh that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing and smile. She reached every milestone early, walking at 9 months, talking in full sentences before she was 2, reading chapter books by age 4. She was the kind of child that strangers would stop my aunt in grocery stores to compliment. But it wasn't just her natural gifts that made everyone fall in love with her. Emma had this way about her, this magnetic personality that drew people in. She was charming and funny and seemed to instinctively know exactly what to say to make adults melt. When she was 3, she told my grandfather that his wrinkles were experience lines that showed how wise he was, and I watched him tear up with pride. When she was 5, she drew my grandmother a picture of the two of them having tea together and wrote, "Best grandma ever," in shaky letters across the top. My grandmother framed it and hung it in her kitchen, right where everyone could see it. I tried to compete at first. I really did. I started drawing pictures too, but mine went on the refrigerator for a few days before mysteriously disappearing. I tried to be charming and funny, but my jokes fell flat while Emma's had everyone laughing. I attempted to be helpful and thoughtful, but somehow my efforts always seemed clumsy compared to Emma's natural grace. It was like trying to shine next to the sun. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Family dinners that used to include questions about my day and my friends suddenly revolved entirely around Emma's latest accomplishment. She had won the spelling bee. She had been chosen for the advanced reading group. She had made friends with the popular kids. She had landed the lead in the school play. On and on it went, while I sat there quietly eating my dinner, invisible. My parents started comparing us constantly, though they probably didn't realize how obvious they were being. "Emma always eats all her vegetables," my mother would say when I left broccoli on my plate. "Emma got straight A's again this semester," my father would mention when I brought home my report card with mostly B's and a few C's. They never said it maliciously, but the message was clear. I was the disappointment, and Emma was the standard I could never reach. The worst part was that Emma seemed genuinely oblivious to the favoritism. She would try to include me in conversations, share her achievements with me as if I should be proud of her too, and invite me to play with her when we were at family gatherings. Her kindness almost made it worse, because it meant I couldn't even properly hate her. She wasn't deliberately stealing the attention. She was just so naturally wonderful that everyone gravitated toward her like planets orbiting the sun. My grandparents' house became the most painful place to be. Grandfather had always been my hero before Emma came along. He was this larger-than-life figure who had built his construction company from nothing, who told the most amazing stories about his adventures, who taught me to play chess and let me help in his workshop. But after Emma arrived, all of that changed. She became his constant companion, sitting on his lap during family dinners while I watched from across the table. She was the one he taught to use his tools, the one he told his stories to, the one he took on special outings to the hardware store and the ice cream shop. Grandmother was no better. She had been the one to teach me to bake cookies and tend her garden, but Emma quickly became her favorite assistant. They would spend hours together in the kitchen, Emma standing on a step stool wearing one of grandmother's aprons, carefully measuring flour while grandmother guided her hands. I would hover in the doorway, hoping to be invited to join, but somehow there was never quite enough room for 3 people in that kitchen anymore. The Christmas when I was 10 and Emma was 3 was particularly brutal. Emma received pile after pile of beautifully wrapped presents, each one more expensive and thoughtful than the last. My grandparents had gotten her a miniature kitchen set that must have cost hundreds of dollars, complete with tiny pots and pans and a working oven light. My parents gave her a collection of advanced art supplies and signed her up for private lessons with a local artist. My aunts and uncles showered her with books and games and clothes that were perfectly suited to her personality and interests. I got a generic gift card to a department store and a book that was too young for my reading level. When I opened the book, I realized it was one that Emma had outgrown the year before. They hadn't even bothered to buy me something new. They had just rewrapped one of her old books and given it to me. I sat there holding this picture book about a cartoon bunny, surrounded by wrapping paper and ribbon, watching Emma squeal with delight over her beautiful gifts, and I felt something break inside me. That was the moment I stopped trying to compete and started learning to disappear. I became quiet and self-sufficient, never asking for help with homework, never requesting rides to friends' houses, never seeking comfort when I was sad or scared. I taught myself to be invisible, to slip through family gatherings like a shadow, present but not noticed, there but not truly seen. School became my refuge. I threw myself into my studies, not because I was naturally brilliant like Emma, but because it was something that was entirely mine. My teachers appreciated my effort and dedication, even if my family didn't notice when I made honor roll semester after semester. I joined the debate team, the newspaper staff, and the volunteer club. I built a life for myself outside of family expectations, outside of Emma's shadow. But even my achievements felt hollow when there was no one to share them with. I would come home excited about winning a debate tournament or getting a story published in the school paper, only to find my parents deep in conversation about Emma's latest triumph. She had won the district science fair. She had been invited to participate in a gifted and talented summer program. She had tested into high school level math while still in elementary school. My victories were footnotes compared to her headlines. The loneliness was overwhelming sometimes. I would lie in bed at night, listening to my parents talk about Emma in the living room below, their voices filled with pride and wonder. They never talked about me that way. I wasn't extraordinary or gifted or special. I was just ordinary, and in my family, ordinary might as well have been invisible. High school offered some relief because Emma was still in elementary school, so there was less direct comparison. I excelled academically, made genuine friends, and even had my first serious relationship with a boy named Marcus who thought I was funny and smart and worth his attention. For a few years, I almost forgot what it felt like to be overlooked, because I had created a world where I mattered. But family gatherings were still torture. Emma was 10 now and even more impressive than before. She was taking high school level courses, performing in community theater productions, and had already started learning 3 different languages. She was also volunteering at an animal shelter and had organized a fundraiser that raised thousands of dollars for homeless pets. She was everything I had never been: effortlessly talented, naturally charismatic, and genuinely altruistic. I remember one particularly painful Thanksgiving when I was 17. I had just been accepted to 3 different colleges with partial scholarships, something I was incredibly proud of because I had worked so hard for it. I waited for a lull in the Emma appreciation session to mention my news, but before I could speak, my aunt launched into a story about how Emma had been personally invited by the mayor to speak at a city council meeting about environmental protection. She was 10 years old and already being consulted by local government officials. My college acceptances seemed pathetically ordinary in comparison. That's when I started to understand that this wasn't just a phase or a temporary situation. This was my reality. Emma would always be the star, and I would always be the footnote. My family loved her more than they loved me, not because I was unlovable, but because she was extraordinary and I was not. It was a painful truth to accept, but once I did, it was almost liberating. I stopped hoping for things to change and started planning my escape instead. College couldn't come fast enough. I chose a school across the country, partly because it offered the best program for my major, but mostly because it was far away from Emma and the constant reminders of my inadequacy. I threw myself into my studies and internships, determined to build a life that was entirely separate from my family's expectations or lack thereof. The distance helped, but it also highlighted just how little I meant to them. My parents would call occasionally, but the conversations were always brief and surface level. They would ask about my grades and my health, but they never asked about my dreams or my fears or the person I was becoming. Meanwhile, Emma's adventures were documented in detail on social media and shared in family group chats that I was sometimes included in and sometimes not. Emma continued to excel at everything she touched. She was valedictorian of her high school class, captain of 3 different sports teams, and had already been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship before her senior year even started. She was also dating the son of a prominent local family, had started her own nonprofit organization, and was being courted by modeling agencies who had discovered her on Instagram. She was 18 and had already accomplished more than most people do in a lifetime. I graduated college with honors and landed a good job at a respected company in a city where no one knew my family or their golden child. I was finally free to be myself without constant comparison, and I started to discover who that person actually was. I was funny and thoughtful and capable. I was a good friend and a loyal partner. I had my own talents and strengths, even if they weren't as flashy as Emma's. I was building a life that felt authentic and fulfilling, even if it was ordinary by my family's standards. But then came the phone call that changed everything. I was 25, living in Portland and working as a marketing coordinator for a sustainable fashion company. I had a small apartment that I loved, a group of close friends who appreciated my dry sense of humor, and a relationship with a wonderful man named David who saw me as extraordinary in my own quiet way. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that felt like enough. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was making dinner and planning to spend the evening reading a book I'd been looking forward to all week. My phone rang, and I almost didn't answer when I saw it was my mother calling. Our conversations had become even more infrequent over the years, usually limited to major holidays and obligatory birthday wishes. "Your grandfather is in the hospital," she said without preamble, her voice tight with worry. "He had a heart attack this morning. It's serious." The world seemed to stop moving for a moment. Grandfather was 78, but he had always seemed invincible to me. He was still running his construction company, still building furniture in his workshop, still challenging anyone who would listen to games of chess that he inevitably won. The idea of him lying helpless in a hospital bed was impossible to process. "How serious?" I managed to ask. "The doctors aren't sure yet. He's stable for now, but—" Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the fear she was trying to hide. "We're all here at the hospital. Emma flew in from Harvard this morning." Of course, Emma was already there. Of course, she had dropped everything to rush to his side while I was 3,000 miles away, completely unaware that anything was wrong. The familiar sting of being the afterthought, the one who was informed rather than consulted, hit me like a physical blow. "I'll try to get a flight," I said, my mind already racing through the logistics of taking emergency, leave from work, and booking last-minute travel. "That would be good," my mother replied, and I could hear the relief in her voice. Not because she particularly needed me there, but because it was what a good granddaughter should do, and she was probably worried about how it would look if I didn't come. I hung up and immediately started making calls. My boss was understanding about the family emergency, and I managed to get on a red-eye flight that would put me back in my hometown by early morning. I packed a small bag, not knowing how long I would need to stay, and tried to prepare myself mentally for whatever I was about to walk into. The flight was endless. I stared out the window at the lights below and thought about my grandfather, really thought about him for the first time in years. I had been so focused on the pain of losing his attention to Emma that I had forgotten all the good memories we shared before she came along. He taught me to hammer nails and measure twice before cutting. He showed me how to plant seeds and wait patiently for them to grow. He told me stories about building his business from nothing, about meeting my grandmother at a church dance, about the importance of working hard and treating people with respect. He had been my first hero, and I had let my resentment over losing him to Emma overshadow all of that. As the plane carried me toward what might be my last chance to see him, I felt a deep sense of regret for all the time I had wasted being angry instead of grateful for the love he had given me, even if it was brief. I arrived at the hospital just after sunrise, exhausted and emotionally raw. The cardiac intensive care unit was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the hushed conversations of medical staff. My family was clustered in the waiting area, looking rumpled and tired after what had clearly been a long night. Emma saw me first, and despite everything, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. She was 23 now and even more beautiful than she had been as a child, but there was a maturity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She stood up and hugged me tightly, and I was surprised by how much I needed that physical comfort. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered against my shoulder. "He's been asking about you." My heart stuttered. "He has." "He made me promise to call you myself if anything happened to him," she said, pulling back to look at me seriously. "He said you were the one who understood him best, and that he needed to know you were okay." I stared at her, trying to process this information. Grandfather had been thinking about me, worrying about me, even after all these years of distance. It didn't make sense with the narrative I had constructed about being forgotten and discarded. "Can I see him?" I asked. The nurses were strict about visiting hours and the number of people allowed in the room at once, but Emma somehow convinced them to make an exception. She had that way about her, that ability to charm people into bending rules without even trying. For once, I was grateful for it. I walked into the ICU room on shaking legs, unprepared for how small and frail my grandfather looked connected to all those machines. His silver hair was mussed, his usually ruddy complexion was pale, and his powerful hands looked fragile resting on the white hospital blanket. But when he saw me, his eyes brightened with an alertness that was purely him. "There's my chess partner," he said, his voice weak but warm. "I was wondering when you were going to show up." I started crying before I could stop myself, overwhelmed by relief that he was awake and aware, and by the realization that I was still his chess partner in his mind, even after all these years of absence. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," I whispered, taking his hand in mine. "I didn't know." "You're here now," he said simply. "That's what matters." We talked for a few minutes about my life in Portland, my job, my relationship with David. He listened intently, asking follow-up questions that showed he remembered details from our previous conversations that I hadn't even realized he was paying attention to. When visiting time was up, he squeezed my hand and said something that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. "You're more like me than any of them realize," he said quietly. "You understand what it means to build something from nothing, to work for what you get. Don't let them convince you that quiet strength is worth less than loud success." Over the next 3 days, I stayed in my hometown, splitting my time between the hospital and my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. Grandfather's condition stabilized, and the doctors became cautiously optimistic about his recovery. The immediate crisis was passing, but the experience had shaken everyone in different ways. I watched my family during those 3 days with fresh eyes, seeing dynamics that I had been too hurt and too young to understand before. My parents weren't cruel or deliberately negligent. They were just overwhelmed by Emma's intensity and achievements. She demanded attention simply by existing, and they had fallen into the pattern of giving it to her because it was easier than trying to balance everyone's needs equally. Emma, for her part, seemed to be struggling with the weight of everyone's expectations. She was exhausted from trying to excel at everything, stressed about maintaining her perfect image, and genuinely concerned about how her success was affecting other family members. During one late-night conversation in the hospital cafeteria, she confessed that she sometimes felt like she was performing rather than living, constantly worried about disappointing people who had placed her on such a high pedestal. "I know everyone compares us," she said quietly, stirring her coffee absently. "I hate it. I never wanted to be the reason you felt left out." It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged the favoritism directly, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't help being extraordinary. But another part of me was still angry about all those years of feeling invisible, and I wasn't ready to absolve everyone of responsibility just because the golden child felt guilty. "It wasn't really about you," I said finally. "It was about them choosing to see only one of us." She nodded, tears in her eyes. I tried to share the attention, but they never seemed interested in looking anywhere else. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing years of complicated family dynamics that neither of us had asked for or known how to navigate. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Grandfather came home from the hospital after a weak but determined to resume his normal activities as quickly as possible. I extended my stay to help with his recovery, and during those additional days, something shifted in our relationship. We spent hours talking while he rested, really talking in a way we hadn't done since I was a child. He told me stories about building his business, about the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. He asked me about my dreams, my fears, my plans for the future. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said one afternoon while we sat in his workshop, him in his favorite chair and me organizing his tools. "Quiet, observant, determined to prove yourself through work rather than words." "I never felt like I reminded you of anything," I admitted. "Emma was always the one you connected with." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Emma is brilliant, and I love her dearly. But brilliance isn't the same as wisdom, and natural talent isn't the same as character. You've built yourself from the ground up, made something meaningful of your life without fanfare or recognition. That takes a different kind of strength." I felt something healing in my chest, a wound I hadn't even realized was still bleeding, slowly closing. "I wish I had known you felt that way." "I should have said it sooner," he acknowledged. "I got caught up in Emma's achievements and forgot to celebrate your quieter victories. That was my failing, not yours." When I finally returned to Portland, something fundamental had changed in how I viewed my family and my place in it. I was still hurt by years of neglect, but I was no longer consumed by it. I had my grandfather's words to hold on to, and the knowledge that at least one person in my family saw and valued who I really was. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal in my carefully constructed independent existence. I threw myself back into work, continued building my relationship with David, and maintained the minimal contact with my family that had become our pattern. Grandfather and I talked on the phone every few weeks, conversations that became the highlight of my month. He would tell me about projects he was working on, ask about my job and my life in Portland, and share observations about the world that reminded me why I had always admired him. Emma went back to Harvard and continued her trajectory toward world domination. She was accepted to law school, won prestigious internships, and started dating someone from a political family who was clearly being groomed for public office. Her life read like a perfect resume, each achievement building on the last in a carefully orchestrated symphony of success. Meanwhile, I was promoted at work, moved to a larger apartment, and started seriously discussing marriage with David. My life was good in quiet, sustainable ways that didn't make headlines but felt authentic and fulfilling. I was learning to appreciate my own path instead of constantly comparing it to Emma's superhighway. Then, on a cold February morning when I was 27, my mother called with news that stopped my world again. "Your grandfather died in his sleep last night," she said, her voice hollow with shock. "His heart just stopped. The doctors said it was peaceful." The grief hit me like a physical blow. Even though I knew his heart attack had increased his risk, he had been doing so well, talking about new projects and planning for spring. The idea that he was simply gone, that I would never hear his voice again or receive his quiet wisdom, was unbearable. I took bereavement leave and flew home for the funeral, my heart heavy with loss and regret. The service was packed with people whose lives my grandfather had touched, employees from his construction company, clients who had become friends, neighbors who remembered his kindness. The pastor spoke about his integrity, his work ethic, and his devotion to family. Emma gave a beautiful eulogy about his love of learning and his support of her education. Various other family members shared memories of his generosity and strength. I sat in the pew listening to all these tributes, feeling the weight of our private conversations, the wisdom he had shared with me during his recovery, the validation he had given me when I needed it most. but I didn't speak at the service. I was still the quiet one, the one who processed grief internally rather than performing it publicly. After the funeral, we all gathered at my grandmother's house for the traditional meal and sharing of memories. The house felt empty without my grandfather's commanding presence, and my grandmother looked lost in her own home. Emma was holding court in the living room, telling stories about grandfather's visits to Harvard and his pride in her achievements. My parents were accepting condolences and discussing the funeral arrangements. I found myself in the kitchen, helping to serve food and clean dishes, invisible even in grief. That's when the family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, arrived and asked us all to gather in the living room. He looked uncomfortable as he explained that my grandfather had very specific instructions about the reading of his will. It was to be done immediately after the funeral, with all family members present, and there were to be no exceptions or delays. We assembled in the living room where my grandfather had told so many stories and played so many games of chess. Mr. Peterson pulled out a thick envelope and began reading in his formal lawyer voice. The initial bequests were standard: money to various charities, specific items to longtime employees, small gifts to friends. Then he began reading the family inheritance section, and everything I thought I knew about my family was turned upside down. To my beloved family, Mr. Peterson read, I have spent my life building something meaningful, and I want to ensure that what I leave behind goes to someone who understands the value of hard work, integrity, and genuine compassion. Therefore, I have devised a series of tests to determine who among my grandchildren truly embodies the values I tried to live by. The room went silent except for the ticking of my grandmother's antique clock. Emma leaned forward, her face bright with interest, clearly confident that whatever tests grandfather had designed would play to her considerable strengths. My parents exchanged glances, probably calculating how much money was at stake. My aunts and uncles shifted in their seats, their children sitting up straighter. Mr. Peterson continued reading. Each of my grandchildren will be given a task that must be completed within 30 days. The task will test not their intelligence or talents, but their character. Whoever completes their task in a manner that demonstrates true understanding of its purpose will inherit my entire estate, including the house, the business, and all financial assets. Those who fail or refuse to participate will receive a token sum of $1,000. The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Emma's eyes were calculating now, trying to figure out what kind of test would challenge her. My cousins from my father's side, Jake and Rebecca, looked nervous but determined. I felt numb, disconnected from the drama unfolding around me. Mr. Peterson raised his hand for silence and continued. The tasks have been sealed in individual envelopes, to be opened only by each grandchild personally. Emma, your task is first. He handed her a cream-colored envelope with her name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. She opened it carefully and read silently, her expression changing from confidence to confusion to something that might have been panic. I don't understand, she said finally. This can't be right. What does it say? My aunt demanded. Emma read aloud. Emma, you have been given every advantage in life, and you have used those advantages to achieve great things. Your task is to spend the next 30 days living as someone who has nothing. You will work a minimum wage job, live in subsidized housing, and survive on food stamps and charity. You may not use your education, your connections, or your family's resources. At the end of 30 days, you will write a report on what you learned about the value of things that cannot be measured by achievements or recognition. This test will measure your humility and your ability to understand the struggles of those less fortunate. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at the paper as if it might change if she looked at it long enough. Her perfect life, her Harvard education, her bright future, none of it would help her with this task. In fact, it would all be a hindrance. That's impossible, my mother said finally. She can't just abandon her life for a month. She has responsibilities, commitments. The will is clear, Mr. Peterson said firmly. Participation is voluntary, but the terms are non-negotiable. Jake and Rebecca received their envelopes next. Jake, who was studying business and had always been obsessed with money and status, was tasked with giving away everything he owned except for basic necessities and spending 30 days volunteering at a homeless shelter. Rebecca, who had never worked a day in her life and treated service workers with casual disdain, had to get a job in food service and live entirely on her wages without any family assistance. When Mr. Peterson handed me my envelope, I felt the weight of my grandfather's expectations and hopes. My hands shook slightly as I broke the wax seal and unfolded the paper inside. "Sarah," it read in his familiar handwriting, "you have spent your life in the shadows, watching and learning, building character without recognition. Your task is different from the others because you have already been living it. For the next 30 days, I want you to step into the light. Use the skills and wisdom you have accumulated to help 3 people in meaningful ways. Document not what you do, but how you feel when you realize that your quiet strength can change lives. This test will measure your ability to recognize your own worth and use it to serve others." I read the task twice, then a third time, trying to understand what my grandfather was asking of me. While the others had been given challenges that would strip away their advantages and force them to experience hardship, I had been asked to embrace my strengths and use them intentionally. It felt like validation and challenge wrapped together. "What does yours say?" Emma asked, and I could hear the strain in her voice. I read it aloud, watching my family's faces as they processed the implications. While Jake, Rebecca, and Emma had been given tasks that would be difficult or humiliating for them, my task seemed almost manageable, which made no sense given the family dynamics I had grown up with. "That's not fair," Jake said immediately. "Her task is easy compared to ours." "Easy?" I looked at him incredulously. "I have to help 3 people in meaningful ways and document how it changes me. How is that easy?" "Because you're already good at that stuff," Rebecca added, her voice whiny with complaint. "You've been doing charity work and helping people for years. The rest of us have to completely change our lives." I stared at my cousins, realizing they had no idea how difficult it would be for someone who had spent their life hiding to suddenly step forward and take action. They saw my task as easier because they didn't understand that visibility was my greatest fear. Emma was studying me with new eyes, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. For the first time, she was seeing me as competition, and it was clearly unsettling for someone who was used to being the unchallenged frontrunner in every race. The meeting broke up with everyone agreeing to think about whether they wanted to attempt their tasks. Emma and my parents had a hushed conversation about the implications for her law school acceptance and her future plans. Jake was already calculating whether the potential inheritance was worth 30 days of poverty. Rebecca was crying because she had never worked in customer service and couldn't imagine being polite to people she considered beneath her. I walked outside into the crisp February air, my grandfather's task burning in my mind. He had seen something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself. This wasn't really about the money or the inheritance. It was about finally stepping into the person he had always believed I could be. That night, I called David and explained the situation. He listened carefully as I read him my task and described the family drama that was unfolding. "So what are you thinking?" he asked when I finished. "I'm thinking my grandfather was smarter than any of us realized," I said. "This isn't just about who gets the money, it's about who understands what really matters." "Are you going to do it?" I was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I think I have to, not for the inheritance, but because he believed I could, and I want to prove him right." The next morning, I extended my leave from work and started planning how to approach my task. I had 30 days to help 3 people in meaningful ways, and I wanted to make sure I chose carefully. This wasn't about random acts of kindness or charitable donations. It was about using my skills and experience to make a real difference in someone's life. I started by thinking about what I was actually good at. I had marketing and communication skills from my job. I had learned patience and observation from years of being overlooked. I had developed independence and problem-solving abilities from taking care of myself. I understood what it felt like to be invisible, to struggle without recognition, to build something meaningful from nothing. The first person I decided to help was Maria, a woman I met at the grocery store where I was buying supplies for my extended stay. She was ahead of me in line, clearly struggling to calculate which items she could afford while her 2 small children waited patiently beside her. She was using a combination of food stamps and crumpled bills, putting things back when she realized she didn't have enough money. I watched this transaction unfold with a familiar ache in my chest, remembering times in college when I had done similar calculations, trying to make my small budget stretch far enough. When Maria left the store with only half of what she had originally selected, I followed her to the parking lot. "Excuse me," I said, approaching carefully so I wouldn't frighten her. "I couldn't help but notice you had to put some things back. Would you let me help?" She looked suspicious at first, probably wondering what I wanted in return. But something in my expression must have convinced her that I was genuine, because after a moment, she nodded. "Just some baby formula and bread," she said quietly. "My youngest is still nursing mostly, but I like to have backup, and my older son eats so much bread." I went back into the store and bought the items she had left behind, plus a few extras that I thought might be useful: peanut butter, crackers, fruit cups, diapers. When I brought the bags to her car, she started crying. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible," I said, "and because someone once told me that quiet strength can change lives." We talked for a few more minutes, and I learned that Maria was a single mother working 2 part-time jobs while trying to finish her nursing degree. She was struggling to pay for childcare and school supplies while keeping her family fed and housed. She was exhausted and overwhelmed, but she was determined to finish her education so she could provide better for her children. Over the next week, I found ways to help Maria that went beyond buying groceries. I used my marketing skills to help her create a professional resume and online profile for nursing job applications. I connected her with a scholarship program I found through online research. I even babysit her children a few times so she could study for exams without distraction. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that Maria had a story that needed to be told. She was an example of resilience and determination that other people needed to hear. I helped her apply for a local news program that featured inspiring community members, and when she was selected, I coached her through the interview process. Watching Maria tell her story on television, seeing her gain recognition for her strength and perseverance, I felt something shift inside me. I had made myself visible in order to make her visible, and the world felt bigger and brighter because of it. My second person was Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who lived alone in the house next to my grandmother's. I had noticed him during my extended stay, always working in his yard, but never seeming to make much progress. His movements were slow and careful, and his garden beds were overgrown with weeds he couldn't manage anymore. I introduced myself one afternoon and offered to help with his yard work. He was initially reluctant, proudly insisting that he could handle it himself, but eventually he accepted my assistance. As we worked together, he told me about his late wife, who had loved gardening and had designed all the flower beds that were now struggling without her care. "I keep trying to maintain what she built," he said, leaning heavily on his rake. "But I don't have her touch, and my body doesn't work like it used to." I could hear the grief and frustration in his voice, and I realized that this was about more than just yard work. Mr. Henderson was trying to hold on to his connection with his wife by maintaining her garden, but he was failing, and that failure was breaking his heart. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent several hours each day working in Mr. Henderson's garden. But instead of just weeding and planting, I asked him to teach me about his wife's design philosophy, her favorite plants, her seasonal routines. I helped him document her gardening wisdom in a notebook that he could reference and share. Together, we restored the garden to something that would have made his wife proud. But more than that, I helped Mr. Henderson see that honoring her memory didn't require him to do everything exactly as she had done it. We adapted her designs to accommodate his physical limitations, created easier maintenance systems, and established a routine that he could sustain independently. The day we finished the restoration, Mr. Henderson stood in his backyard looking at the neat flower beds and healthy plants, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She would love this," he said quietly. "Thank you for helping me find a way to keep her alive in this garden." I realized that I had learned something important about love and loss, about the ways we honor the people who matter to us, and about the difference between preserving something exactly as it was and keeping its spirit alive in new forms. My third person was actually someone from my past. my former college roommate Jessica, who had reached out to me through social media a few days into my 30-day challenge. She was going through a difficult divorce and needed help navigating the process while protecting her children's emotional well-being. Jessica and I had been close during college, but we had lost touch after graduation when life pulled us in different directions. She was now a single mother of 2 young children, trying to rebuild her life after discovering that her husband had been having an affair and draining their joint accounts to support his secret second family. "I don't know who else to ask," she said during our phone call. "I need someone who understands what it's like to feel like you're not enough, because that's all I can think about right now. He chose someone else, and I keep wondering what was wrong with me." I understood that feeling intimately, having spent my childhood wondering why Emma was more lovable than me. I flew to Jessica's city and spent a long weekend helping her organize her legal documents, research divorce attorneys, and create a plan for her financial recovery. But more importantly, I listened to her process the emotional trauma of betrayal and abandonment. I helped her understand that her husband's choices were a reflection of his character, not her worth. I shared my own experiences with feeling invisible and inadequate, and together we explored how those feelings had shaped our understanding of ourselves. By the end of the weekend, Jessica had a clear action plan for her divorce proceedings and a support system in place for her emotional recovery. She also had a renewed sense of her own strength and value, which had been damaged by years of emotional manipulation from her ex-husband. "You saved me," she said as I prepared to leave. "I was drowning and you threw me a lifeline." "You saved yourself," I corrected. "I just reminded you that you were strong."